From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., Cole on Congress. The program discussing national issues that affect Oklahoma. Your host, U.S. Representative Tom Cole.
Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Cole on Congress. Today's guest is well known throughout Oklahoma as a friend of farmers and ranchers. Frank Lucas has represented northwestern Oklahoma in Congress since 1994. He's the ranking Republican member on the Agriculture Committee and also serves on the Financial Services and Science and Technology Committees, and I'm pleased to serve with him. So I've invited him to join us. But I always like to begin these things personal, and Frank and I, as you know, we were talking about how long we have known one another and when we first met.
Clearly, Tom, we were babies because you and I have had a working relationship now for at least 30 years.
Yeah, that is hard to believe. You were president of the College Republicans at Oklahoma State University, and I was a much younger executive director of the Oklahoma Republican Party, and we've done a lot of things since then.
But the things that we cared about then still apply now. Balancing the budget, guarding our constitutional rights, trying to help Oklahoma and the country move forward, strong defense. Ironically, everything you and I worked on and fought for back then are still the same issues we work for and fight for now.
Absolutely true. I'm going to take some pardonable pride in continuing your legislative or your political career, and I want to give a great big plug to Henry Bellman because, as you will recall, you twice ran for the state legislature, once when I was state chairman unsuccessfully, and then we had an open seat. The third time around, you'd come closer each time. And we all knew you were the only guy that could win that seat. And but talking you, and more importantly, talking Linda Lucas into letting this happen a third time. I remember calling Governor Bellman at the time, and I said, Governor, I need you to talk to Frank Lucas about why this needs to happen, and can you call him and have him visit with you in the governor's mansion, which of course he did, and thank goodness you ran.
Well, the governor could be very persuasive, very persuasive. And I've got to admit, Tom, I'll always think about the straightforward advice you gave me as state party chairman. And for anyone who's never been in a campaign, it's kind of an intense experience. It's wonderful if you win, but if you don't quite get there, it adds to the intensity on your supporters, your loved ones, everyone around you. And the third go-around, I'd taken on an incumbent Rules Committee chairman in the House as a 24-year-old. Didn't quite beat him. A matter of fact, it was a 58-42 race, but in our hometown, or in our home county, I tied him, and in our home community, I prevailed rather solidly. As you remember,
it's only 8% registered
8% Republican registration at the time in Roger Mills. Ran a second time, took on the hand-picked successor. We split the district 3 counties for me, 3 counties for a neighbor. I lost by 90-some votes on election night. But that third time around, when Governor Bellman was so persuasive, I came in and sat down with you, and you explained to me in the most straightforward of terms, which sometimes is what a potential candidate or a public official needs, is straightforward input. You observed to me that if I ran a third time and was successful, no one would remember the previous 2 races. I would be patted on the back as a fellow with determination, commitment. I had goals, integrity, and focus. And you said, if you run a third time and you lose, you'll just be the same old fool everybody knew. Well, you know, I kind of snarled at the time about that, I suppose, Tom, but that was the most honest and accurate advice. And I took that input, and Governor Bellman's encouragement, and permission from Linda Lucas, and lo and behold, the third time we won by 1,490-some votes.
Wow.
And down the trail since
then.
then.
Here you are in Congress. Well, let's talk about what you're doing in Congress now, because
Yes.
No question, agriculture is the base industry of our state. You know, one of the great pillars of our economy, something that we did 100 years ago, something we're going to be doing 100 years from now. So, what do you see as the main challenges that Oklahoma agriculture faces right now?
From a day-to-day basis from the federal government, our biggest challenge is maintaining the funding, the resources committed to us in the '08 Farm Bill. And many of our listeners will be familiar. Farm bills in recent history have been written 5 years at a time. Congress makes a commitment that resources for conservation and rural development, ag credit, nutrition, the commodity titles, conservation, all of those things will be there. You can count on it. The biggest single challenge I face as ranking member, senior Republican on the Ag Committee, is to make sure that the commitments of the '08 Farm Bill are honored to their conclusion in 2013. Now, unfortunately, the administration we have right now, in all fairness, in their $3.8 trillion federal budget that you and I know both, if it's adopted, ultimately will create a $4 trillion deficit in their first 3 years. The two areas they make proposed cuts that I'm painfully aware of are in defense, canceling weapons programs,
Absolutely.
and just as importantly, they want to roll back spending on the farm safety net by $1.5 trillion. They want to take $8 billion out of the crop insurance program, the monies that make that program work. They talk about reducing conservation programs, EQIP, and all, the Wetlands Reserve Program, and all these things.
This is a great environmental administration, too,
Yes.
which seems very much at odds with their thrust in that area.
Oh, clearly, Tom, the two most important things we can do is defend this country and make sure we have enough to eat. Those are the two fundamental things, in my opinion, that matter, yet we're talking about reducing in both. And conservation programs, things like EQIP, a cost share program that helps farmers and ranchers and landowners do the basic practices, sow grass, plug gullies, build small dams, cross fence, enhance wildlife quality, enhance water quality, take the dust out of the air, all of those things, yet they want to even reduce those programs. That's the biggest upfront challenge, is protecting us, or our commitments, I should say, to the Farm Bill from the Obama administration. Number two, making sure that farmers and ranchers have the resources and the technology to compete around the world. Part of that's trade agreements, a part of that's the commitment to research dollars, a part of that's just having a department that's responsive to rural America. And right now, we have some struggles on all those fronts. You and I both have been mortified by the fact that we have 3 free trade agreements ready to go, South Korea, Panama, Colombia, that would open markets up to U.S. agricultural products right now, but for whatever political reason, the administration won't send those down to us to vote on. That just floors me. The president has said that he understands increasing trade is important to agriculture. Well, let's do the things that will make a difference right now. Technology, making sure that we stay at the forefront. And there are those people at the USDA, unfortunately, and I think at EPA, who have a different definition of what progress is all about. We need to support, oh, by the way, our land-grant universities like Oklahoma State, but our Agricultural Research Service in the Department of Agriculture, making sure those resources are there, those kind of things, Tom. So it's a competitive world we're in, and we need the support of the administration, and we need the support of the federal agencies, and we also need to live up to those commitments we've made. And that's a big part of my job. If we can do that, we'll be okay.
Well, and of course, your challenges aren't even directly on the Ag Committee. If you were one of our leaders in the debate against cap and trade recently, cap and tax, and a lot of people understand what that kind of system would do to their utility bills and their gasoline bills, but I don't think a lot of them understand what it might do to their food bills. And you might talk to our audience a little bit about that.
We all need to remember in this country, it seems to me the ultimate goal of the administration and former Vice President Gore and a number of people who are do-gooders to the max, their goal is to change ultimately world weather patterns by changing how we conduct our lives in the United States, by reducing what goes up the exhaust pipe, or as my farm and ranch friends would say, what goes out the four-legged horizontal exhaust pipe too. And they propose in the bill that you and I and the entire Oklahoma delegation voted against in the House to do that by giving the federal government the power to set quotas on what goes up or what goes out by region, by industry, giving the federal government to determine what can be exhausted across the whole country, and then establishing priorities so that some people will get quotas that would meet or exceed what they need. Some would get quotas that won't meet and exceed what they need. And if your quota is less ultimately in this proposal than what you need, you either have to turn down what you're doing, reduce what you're outputting, or you have to go find someone who, by the benevolence of a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., got more than he or she really needed, and you get to pay them for their unused exhaust. Talking about picking winners and choosers. And don't forget, Tom, you and I have discussed many times the second part of the equation. That is the goal of the bill to dramatically reduce energy consumption, because they know if you slow down the refineries, the power plants, you affect emissions. So you raise the price of gasoline and diesel by taxing at the refinery. You raise the price of electricity by taxing at the power plant. And lo and behold, they come up with $700 billion to spend on other things. Ultimately, because agriculture is a big consumer of energy, what it takes to produce the fertilizers, the chemicals, prepare the seeds, to till the soil, to raise the crops, to irrigate, to harvest, to process, to deliver, the energy to keep the coolers running at the supermarket, to keep our products safe and attractive and tasty to consumers. All that requires energy. If they do the things they want in cap and tax, your food will cost more, you will have a reduced variety to pick from, and it certainly won't be of the quality you've had in the past. It's just the way it will be.
Well, and that has consequences throughout the economy. Again, I don't think most people realize, you go back to 1941, census of 1941, maybe we'll talk about a census in a minute. Mm-hmm. 1 out of every 5 Americans, 19%, worked on a farm. Today, 3%, less than 3%, and yet they not only feed the country, they feed the world. But if you're going to take that much labor out of the system, you had to, number one, put energy in it. Now, the other thing that the farm economy does for the entire rest of the economy, Americans spend a lower percentage of their disposable income on food than any other people on the planet. And guess what they get to do with the rest of that income? Well, they can invest it, they can purchase things. It drives the rest of the economy. The efficiency of agriculture, the ability, as you put it earlier, most important thing is to be able to eat. The ability to do that at a reasonable price is what creates the surplus that runs everything else.
Exactly. And we raise so much more than we can consume. Our agricultural sales around the world are a major source of revenue to offset the balance of a trade deficit, which is substantial because of crude oil and a lot of manufactured products we make. So ag's critically important. You're exactly right.
Well, a lot of barriers to American agriculture around the world. I remember in 2005 taking a trip with, Speaker Hastert was a very good friend of yours, mm-hmm. and certainly a good friend of mine as well. And we were in Japan. We were meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister. Adam Putnam, our colleague from Florida, was on that trip, and he represents, as you do, of course, a great agricultural district. And the speaker looked at Adam and me, and he said, "Putnam, Cole, your job's to talk about beef and talk about restrictions." I always did strike me that we had one incident of mad cow disease from not an American cow, a Canadian cow, and yet, that was the excuse to block us out of the beef markets in Japan. And fortunately, we haven't reacted that way to car incidents recently, so to speak. But people are always anxious not to compete head-to-head with American farmers.
Exactly, and we've got to maintain that technological edge. So that's why it's so important that the administration not carry through with their threatened budget cuts across the board in agriculture, and that we have the regulatory environment. You and I both know, and we're very concerned about this and we fight it every day, if ultimately the Speaker Pelosi, and President Obama cannot secure their global warming bill, their cap and tax bill, it appears they're going to use the Environmental Protection Agency through the rulemaking process to force the rules and regs down our throat anyway. And there again, it's worth noting, I think, as always to our listeners, the senior, and you've been through this, Tom, the senior policymakers in any department and agency are not the career government servants, the civil servants. They are political appointees. You do not run an agency such as the EPA, at the top levels if you've not been cleared by the White House political machine. Correct, Tom?
That's correct.
So they are using the machinery of the bureaucracy where they can't get their way politically to force their programs on us anyway. And that should infuriate folks back home the way it does you and I. If you can't get your elected officials to do it, using a faceless bureaucrat in D.C. to do it is just, it's almost dastardly.
I did mention the census a minute ago, and I know this is a topic that you focus on, and we all do for a couple of reasons. We went through the pain of losing a congressional seat.
Yes.
not too long ago in 2000, and that diminishes the clout of the state in Washington, D.C. And then beyond that, obviously, there are billions of dollars worth of federal programs that are formula-driven and population-driven. If you don't have an accurate count, you're going to be delivering money to the wrong place.
And it's also worth noting, you and I have a lot of constituents who are very staunch supporters of the Constitution. The census is a constitutional responsibility of every citizen. The Constitution says that every 10 years we shall count the people in this country to apportion to determine how many seats in the United States House each state receives. So since 1790, every 10 years we've counted. And over time, those same numbers have been used now to draw not only congressional lines and apportion seats among the states, but they draw state Senate lines back home, state representative lines, county commissioner lines, even some city council lines. So if you want your fair share, not only as you alluded to, Tom, of your taxpayer monies back, but if you want your fair share of your representation in D.C., Oklahoma City, down at the courthouse, down at City Hall, they've got to fill out those forms that are coming out this month. It's a responsibility.
Well, if they just didn't arrive the same time the tax forms arrived, they'd probably get a much better response rate. So, anyway, well, let me ask you about this because you serve on a couple other committees. We always talk about agriculture that are really some of the most important committees in Congress. I'm particularly interested because it's in the news of your views in the science and technology area on NASA and some of the issues coming up there, and then I'll move to some of the financial issues in a moment because financial regulatory reform is a hot button right now, and you're on the Financial Services Committee as well.
Ironically, the Science Committee is one that rarely comes up in my town meetings back home, but it's a committee with jurisdiction over NASA and the space programs, both manned and non-manned, or person and non-person, whatever they say in D.C., but it's also the National Science Foundation. It's a variety of programs. I joined the committee 8 or 9 years ago when there was an opening. In addition to ag and financial services, I had to have special permission at the time because of the efforts in Burns Flat to create a spaceport. And we've done the logistics to do that. We just need the right company to utilize that huge slab of concrete out there for takeoffs and landings of space planes. But I also joined the committee because of its potential to influence the science research dollars, making sure that we received our fair share. Of late, though, the greatest controversy is essentially the Obama administration announcing that they want to cancel the Constellation program, the next manned space vehicle and the booster rockets to go with it was started in the Bush administration. They're trying to make up their mind now whether they want to temporarily extend the shuttle program, which is set to expire this fall. It's 1960s engineering, great stuff at the time, but the world's moved on since the 60s and 70s. Or, as some people have hinted, pay the Russians or the Chinese to fly us into space. I think that's a critical mistake. We should be continuing our efforts at maintaining our edge in spaceflight. It's just a part of our overall responsibilities to move the frontier forward. Keeping the old shuttle program up and going is incredibly expensive. But the thought of paying the Russians or the Chinese to fly our astronauts up and back because we can't do it ourselves, just amazing, Tom. And I would say this, and I know this may sound a little harsh, but this is an administration that's focused themselves very much as being Camelot Part 2. And for some of our listeners, that's generally referred to the period of the Kennedy administration in the early 60s before his life was tragically taken. The space program, manned space, is one of the Kennedy legacies that still goes on now. By stepping away from the manned space program, it's ironic that this administration is undoing one of the great accomplishments of the Kennedy administration. I just find it so ironic.
Well, and I honestly think you have to look at some of our peer competitors here. And what the Russians went through a total economic collapse at the end of the old Soviet Union. They never left space. They never lost their toehold there because I think they understood how important it was. The Chinese, who have enormous challenges and frankly on a per capita basis certainly aren't anywhere close to as wealthy as the United States, continue to make significant investments in this area, putting men into space, developing the vehicles. I would think twice about leaving the field of competition here, so to speak, while some of our peer competitors, if you will, see the advantages and are, if anything, doubling down their investment.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, tell me a little bit about financial services, because that has been a huge question next to healthcare and cap and trade. Probably the issues surrounding what do we do in the wake of the financial meltdown we have. What's the appropriate structure to regulate the financial markets going forward? And it's heating up here, as you know. So I'd love to sort of get your overview of the critical issues and where we ought to go.
The real challenge is we've had a dramatic change in philosophy and management style in the form of Chairman Barney Frank of Massachusetts. Very capable, very bright fella, but he has a slightly different philosophical perspective than Chairman Oxley before him. Barney's embarked on an effort. His view, I think, is that the reason we have these financial problems is because over the previous 30 years, we'd probably given too much flexibility out there in the markets, and perhaps as new products have evolved, the federal government wasn't aggressive enough. I would tell you that the housing boom and bust and bubble essentially was a classic bubble in ways similar to bubbles going all the way back to the tulip boom in Holland in the 1700s. We had a circumstance where several generations of Congress, including Chairman Frank, had advocated that the key was to make housing more affordable. And they drove programs in a direction that made it easier and easier and easier to secure loans. Well, we all want people to have a chance at home ownership in a house. But they got the terms in some of these agreements down so low that it set off this demand spurge. People were buying homes and trading homes and selling property and playing it for speculation, not for long-term home ownership. The old traditional 30-year mortgage of our parents' time, the 20-year mortgage of your day and my day, had become these variable rate things with adjustable interest rates and make no principal payments and balloon payments and just all sorts of outlandish things. And when the top got to the top, sooner or later, like all bubbles, it had to bust. I think what we've done to get a refocus on Freddie and Fannie and the other institutions is the right thing to do. But now the committee in some areas is moving past that, not just addressing the housing problems, but there's some areas where they're trying to dramatically increase and expand federal regulation. I represent a district, Tom, that has one common theme amongst ag, energy, the Main Street business folks, and that is we're capital starved in Northwest Oklahoma. We operate on borrowed money. And if this majority in Congress and this administration stays on the present course, they're going to make capital scarcer, less available. They're going to make it more costly. They're going to have it tied with more strings to it. And that will ultimately hurt my people, because we have to, whether you're a farmer, an oil field service company outfit, or just a retailer down on Main Street selling services or products, you've got to have the capital to operate. And they are driving us in a direction. Well, I guess there's no great irony that the same group of people who want to nationalize health care, who want to give government control of every exhaust pipe in the country, would want to have Uncle Sam be the dominant force in the financial services industry. You saw just this week as they took the ability of private financial institutions to be in the student loan business away and made it exclusively federal government. You and I think, believe in competition. Different choices, different sources, people competing. They just made it a government enterprise, a monopoly. That's not good, and that's the kind of stuff we're seeing.
Put 31,000 people out of work in the process, which is the
Yes.
number that serviced the student loan industry before.
Yes.
I don't know why we're destroying private sector jobs to add to the public payroll. Let me ask you this, because the sheer range of issues that you talked about from the level of a senior member, now the most important Republican in agriculture in the House of Representatives, one of the very senior members on financial services, one of the very senior Republicans on science and technology, underlines the value of sticking around this institution a little bit, which you've lectured all of the rest of us on as your junior colleagues, regardless of our age. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about Oklahoma's positioning in Congress and the things that ought to happen going forward to make sure that the state exercises as much influence and defends its interests as well as it possibly can.
It's worth bearing in mind, Tom, when you and I were kids, we had members like Paige Belcher, we had Tom Steed, we had Carl Albert, we had people who served 20, 25 years. Now, I know there's an anti-incumbency mood out there in many general areas, but those, ladies and gentlemen, Republicans and Democrats both, I think were the key in enabling us to have the five outstanding military facilities we have now, who do such good work, from Tinker to Sill to Vance to Altus to the munitions plant in McAllister. Think of the hundreds of big dams that we have for water and recreation, and the tens of thousands of small flood control dams for protection of people downstream. Those things came about because for example, because our predecessors had enough clout and enough patience to put Oklahoma priorities into the federal process and to make that happen. I now, serving with you, am in my third federal delegation. We've turned over 3 complete times since 1994. That's not in the best interest, I'm afraid, of the Oklahoma the Oklahoma state of Oklahoma for that matter. I encourage my friends, and you've heard me say this to you and everyone else, if you're going to come to Congress, then come with a commitment to stay and let's work. Pick committees that you enjoy, that you understand, that you have background for, that are important in your district, and dig in and work. Develop the skill sets and the respect of the membership to be able to accomplish things. I started out as 434 in the House membership, one off the bottom. I started this session at 122. There's already at least 9 people ahead of me who will not be back for some reason. I've gotten to the point where, on ag policy, on a certain amount of the financial service issues, I have respect, I think, amongst our colleagues. I have the ability to drive the process. And I would tell you, Tom, given a choice between putting our Oklahoma perspective on things and accepting someone else's perspective, we're always better off with the Oklahoma way of doing things.
Well, I tell you, it is one of those things that people don't realize very often. But just showing up in committee, both being educated by the testimony, and frankly, having a chance to deal with your colleagues in a question and answer, give and take basis, not in the sort of theatrical, atmosphere of the floor, is what builds the relationships. Not only within your committees and with your party members, but much more importantly across party lines, so that when that critical point comes, regardless of who's in the majority, you're a guy that knows something that they'll listen to.
And it's always worth bearing in mind, we serve in the United States House at the discretion of our constituents for 2 years at a time. We ask their permission, you and I both ask their permission every 2 years. A part of this being able to stay is working hard and staying focused on what's important at home, to continue to have their permission to work on their behalf to make these things happen. So we should never, and I know you don't, and I don't, we should never get away from that perspective.
Well, we're down to our last couple minutes, but I can't resist asking you this question. You came here in one of the great wave elections, and really were the guy that was the first. I don't know if our listeners know this, but one of your nicknames for a while around here was Domino Man, because you were the first domino in the '94 cycle, because you'd come in a special and sort of an early sign of what was going on. I'm not asking for a partisan perspective, but what's it like in a situation like that? What's it like to run, and what's it like in terms of the mood of the country?
Tom, when you
see similarities or
when you
differences?
represent being a force for change away from the status quo, and the people are ready to make a change, it's a wonderful thing. Now, setting partisan issues aside, I think that once again, you and I represent that force wanting to change away from the status quo that we've seen for the last 1.5 years in the House, the last 3.5 in Congress in general. That's why I enjoy my town meetings these days. Not everybody enjoys their town meetings back home. I see the look on your face when you come back. We enjoy it. '94 was a unique and wonderful experience. I thought I would never see it again. But I think we might just get to share the second round of that this time, you and I both.
Certainly forces of change in the air, and frankly there have been for several years. I think the American people are resolving some big issues. Well, Congressman, we're just about out of time, and I want to thank you. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of Cole on Congress. And until next time, this is Congressman Tom Cole in our nation's capital. I want to thank you for joining us. And Frank, it's a great pleasure, always is, just to listen to you. And thank you for taking the time out and visiting with my constituents.
Very much so.